All right, if you've watched Mr. McCarty's video, you know that the Constitution was not America's first plan for government. If you have not watched his video, stop what you're doing. Go watch it now. All right, you done? Now that you've watched it, you know that the Articles of Confederation created a weak central government, and it wasn't until a militia of rebellious farmers from western Massachusetts nearly toppled the Massachusetts state government that the leaders of the states decided that the Articles might need some changes. What resulted, the miracle at Philadelphia, was the creation of a new constitution and with it, a new nation. The first thing we should remember is that not all of the states were sold on the idea of revising the Articles of Confederation. In fact, Rhode Island had boycotted the convention altogether. They had deeply feared that a strong central government might abuse its power and silence the states. And this fear was pervasive among the new states. Shouldn't come as a big surprise. This is the main complaint against the British government. So we can understand why the states would want a weak central government. It just seemed to many of them that the government they created had gone too far in the other direction. So 55 delegates from 12 states met from May to September of 1787. Notable among the delegates were George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. Notably absent were Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, some of the most ardent revolutionaries. One of the first votes that the delegates took was regarding secrecy. On May 29th, 1787, the delegates voted to keep the proceedings a secret. They shut the blinds and locked the doors. So the story goes, Benjamin Franklin required a chaperone when he went out at night in Philadelphia for fear that he might have a couple of pints of ale and start spilling some of their secrets. They wanted to avoid the press getting a hold of any of the ideas that they were bringing up in this convention for fear that they would sink the ideas before they even had a chance to get them out. The stated goal of the convention was to propose changes to the Articles of Confederation, but it soon became clear that a more comprehensive overhaul was going to be necessary. And this was immediately controversial. The framers knew it. I mean, imagine today if we sent 49 delegates from 49 of our 50 states to Washington, D.C. to try and propose some changes to our Constitution. Let's fix it. Let's catch it up. Let's get it up to date. And instead, what they did was threw it out and created a new plan for government. So this is going to be controversial. Over the course of the summer, the delegates debated the interests of the various states and produced a constitution that has been called a bundle of compromises. Remember, at this time, Americans saw themselves as Virginians, as New Yorkers, as Delawareans, not as Americans. In fact, it was true for many Americans right up until the Civil War. In fact, it might be true today. I've known a few Californians or Texans that may still feel that way. It's one of the unique challenges of the American system to preserve the power of the states, but bind us all together under the power of a new national constitution. All right, so what are these compromises? Let's take a closer look at the biggest ones. First, we had the issue of slavery, more specifically the issue of the slave trade. There was no serious talk of abolishing slavery at the Constitutional Convention. Most of the northern states saw slavery as a dying institution with no economic future. They had no way of knowing at the time the impact that the cotton gin would have just 5 years later. And we're going to talk about that more in the coming weeks. So what were they debating? Well, there was a lot of talk about the slave trade, which many people at the time did find repugnant. The South wanted to continue importing slaves from Africa, while the northern states wanted to end the international slave trade. So a committee was put together to discuss this issue, and the committee ultimately agreed to allow Congress to outlaw the international slave trade, but not until 1808. Included in this compromise was a provision that allowed Congress to tax imports, but not exports. Why, you might ask? Well, the taxing of imports will protect northern industry. It allows them to tax their international competitors. And since the South is producing primarily raw materials, it's going to allow them to trade freely with consumers of their raw materials, since the new government will not be allowed to tax exports. Additionally, southern states brought up the issue of runaway slaves. Though, as you learned, the Northwest Ordinance had prohibited the introduction of slavery into the territory of the Old Northwest, it had guaranteed the return of slaves that escaped to that territory. Southern states wanted a similar promise in the Constitution. They got it with what became known as the Fugitive Slave Clause. This clause said that any person held to service or labor, which usually meant a slave, could have meant an apprentice or an indentured servant, who flees to another state shall be returned to his or her master in the state from which that person escaped. So if you want to escape slavery, you need to make it out of all of the states, out of the entire United States, Just like later, when we talk about slaves escaping slavery, the Underground Railroad, it will terminate in Canada. All right. Next is going to be a series of compromises regarding how states would be represented in the new national government. The delegates had agreed to separate the government's power into 3 separate branches: the legislature, which is the lawmaking branch, the executive, which is the law enforcing branch, and the judicial, which is the law interpreting branch. This would dilute the power of the federal government. They also added a system of checks and balances that would require that they all work together and that no one branch would become too powerful. However, the big question of how representation would be determined still lingered on. The large states are going to rally around James Madison's large state plan, also known as the Virginia Plan. Madison suggested that representation should be proportional. Large states should have more representation than the small states. This may sound reasonable, but remember, states viewed themselves as independent, and this meant giving up some of that independence. They never liked to do this. The delegates from the state of New Jersey proposed a response to the large state plan known as the small state plan, also became known as the New Jersey plan. The small state plan argued that representation should be based on a principle of equal representation. The articles had given each state 1 vote, and the small states wanted to keep it that way. Ultimately, it took a compromise. Known as the Great Compromise and proposed by the delegates from Connecticut, it suggested that the Congress be composed of 2 houses, a lower house and an upper house. The lower house, they suggested, should have proportional representation. The bigger your state's population, the more votes you get in the lower house. This is what we know today as the House of Representatives. Upper house, on the other hand, would be based on equal representation. Each state would send 2 representatives to the upper house. This is what we know as the Senate today. The 2 houses would have to work together to legislate. Each would have some unique responsibilities. The upper house would confirm presidential nominations, guaranteeing that states had an equal say, while the lower house would be responsible for proposing all taxing and spending bills, which would give the larger states more influence over the power of the purse. This compromise saved the Constitution and resulted in the Constitution that we all know and love. This is why today we call Connecticut the Constitution State. Remember, it's the delegates from Connecticut that came up with it. Thanks, Connecticut. But this compromise, this great compromise, raised yet another question. If representation is based on population, who counts as part of your state's population? Well, that might seem a simple question, right? People count. People count as people. Well, we need to remember that there was a class of people that had traditionally been denied their status as legal people, slaves. So how do we count slaves? Well, the South wanted them counted, and the North argued that slaves were legally property and thus shouldn't be counted for the purposes of representation. Hopefully the irony is not lost on you. Here now we have Southerners arguing that slaves are people and should be counted as such. Of course they're arguing that. It's going to benefit them politically. What about the North? Now conceding that slaves are property? But this is what the convention was all about. It was more of a political problem-solving process than an ideological exercise. We can contrast the ideological nature of the Declaration of Independence with the practical or pragmatic nature of the United States Constitution. So how'd they work this one out? Well, when they crunched the numbers, they agreed that in order to give Southern states a fair amount of representatives, they would be allowed to count the Southern states 3/5 of their slave population for the purposes of representation. This became known as the 3/5 Compromise. It literally said that slaves count as 3/5 of a person. Again, the writing committee, so the guys in charge of the language that was going to end up in the Constitution, refused to use the word slavery, and instead they referred to free persons and all other persons. The term slave is left out. Though the Constitution included provisions to protect the institution of slavery and it denied rights to slaves, the term never appears in the document. I like to think that this might reveal tensions in the thinking of these framers who had just fought a war against tyrants, but they didn't have the political will or perhaps the political courage to address their own tyranny. All right, so those are the big ones. Other main agreements were that an electoral college would select the president for a period of 4 years. There was fear that large states would have too much say if it were based on a national vote. Sound like a familiar debate? Further, federal judges, once appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, were given life terms so they could be above politics. Again, something that's in the news. Ultimately, it was generally understood that the states would retain much of the powers that they had traditionally assumed prior to the drafting of this new Constitution. But it was undeniable that this new Constitution created a much stronger an influential central government. This Constitution did create a national government, however, of limited powers. So there you have it. The delegates voted on September 17th, 1787 to propose the new Constitution, and we all lived happily ever after. Not true. If only it were that simple. Proposing the Constitution was just the beginning. Now it needed to be approved by the states, a process called ratification. So check out my next video to learn more about the battle for ratification. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.